Iran is enriching uranium to a higher level again in violation of an agreement that aims to see that the country never gets a nuclear weapon. It is insisting that US sanctions are lifted before it abandons the program. Is the European Union at all capable of bringing the two sides together? This is Roundtable. Very good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The idea of informal talks suggested by the European Union has been rebuffed by Iran, even though President Biden has indicated that he is perhaps willing to rejoin the deal that Donald Trump quit 3 years ago. In the delicate diplomatic work of reviving the Iran nuclear deal, the European Union is a key player. The EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, has been talking up the prospects of progress, saying recently that Iran could comply with its nuclear obligations if the United States rejoins the 2015 nuclear deal. The agreement is officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, and it was signed in 2015 by Iran, the United States, China, Russia, France, the UK, Germany, and the EU. Under the deal, Tehran has committed to limit its nuclear activity to civilian purposes and to allow inspections. In return, world powers agreed to drop their economic sanctions against Iran. But in 2018, the US, under Donald Trump, unilaterally withdrew from the agreement and reimposed sanctions, prompting Tehran to step up its nuclear activity. So the European Union is trying to get the players back to the table to revive the nuclear deal. Can it succeed? And what does Europe hope to gain if Iran comes in from the cold? Right, as we start this conversation, let's go to Princeton in the United States, where we welcome back to Roundtable Seyed Hossein Mousavian, nuclear policy specialist at Princeton University, former Iranian diplomat who worked on nuclear negotiations. In Brussels, we see Amanda Paul. She is from the Europe Policy Center. Welcome to the program, Amanda. And from North Carolina in the United States, Klaus Larres comes back to join us, Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Hossein, let's get technical to start with. How far advanced do you think Iran's nuclear program is?
Iran nuclear program is relatively in advanced situation. However, it is fully under control. And after 15 years of the most intrusive inspections, in every report of the IAEA, you would see that there is no evidence of any diversion toward weaponization. Therefore, remains peaceful, and I hope with the revival of JCPOA, everyone would be comfortable about the future of Iranian nuclear program.
Let me run through something I read in an article on the International Institute of Strategic Studies, well-respected writers on that site. It said under the JCPOA, Iran was allowed 3.67% enriched uranium. A lot of it now is 20%. It was allowed 300 kilograms of this. It's now 8 times that. And it said under the probable circumstances that exist at the moment, Iran could be 8 months to 1 year away from a nuclear bomb.
First of all, it is extremely important to understand still among all 7 signatories of the JCPOA, Iran is the only most committed member. The US totally failed with 0 compliance. After Trump's withdrawal, the Europeans, they remained politically a member, but practically they failed to deliver their commitments. 0 compliance in practice. Iran, until last week, implemented at least 70% of the commitments, and now with suspending the additional protocol, 50%. And even China and Russia, although they are supporting the deal, although they are still continuing their economic relations, but in practice, they have complied with 30% of their commitments because of the US sanctions. Therefore, we are in a situation which is completely unbalanced. A time for 3 years, Iran fully complied, and the rest they failed to for full compliance.
But Hossein,
And
let me just
now
say this. The International Institute of Strategic Studies says this is not the case. It suggests Iran, if it wanted to, could have a nuclear bomb within 8 months to a year. Do you deny that is possible at all?
I believe Iran, whenever Iran decides to have nuclear bomb, they can have nuclear bomb. No one can prevent Iran before JCPOA, after JCPOA. The reason Iran has not mastered nuclear bomb is not because of NPT, or it is more because of the religious fatwa of all grand ayatollahs of Shia, which they believe all weapons of mass destruction are religiously haram, forbidden. That's why I don't believe really JCPOA is an instrument to prevent Iran from nuclear weapon, because Iran without NPT, without JCPOA, would not go to master nuclear bomb because of the religious beliefs.
Okay, Amanda, let me ask you, what's Europe's take on this? What can it do to stop this escalating in any way?
I mean, from the perspective of the EU, the only way forward is to get the JCPOA back on track. The Americans were the to actually pull out of the JCPOA. So in many respects, it's up to the United States to take the first step. I don't see any other option, because clearly putting more and more pressure onto Iran is not going to have any positive result. It's just going to result in, let's say, more resistance. I think an important role for High Representative Borrell to carry out shuttle diplomacy between Iran and the United States, but also bringing in the other partners, you know, the Russia and China, to find a way forward. I mean, there's no other option apart from the JCPOA to, let's say, halt Iran's nuclear program.
Okay, well, let's hear from Borrell himself.
This gives diplomacy a chance. This gives the possibility of restarting the process and being able to make everybody to sit again in the table in order to implement the proposal from the United States of coming back to the JCPOA. This is a very important decision. It's much more difficult to go back to the JCPOA than to go back to the climate agreement. To go to the climate agreement is not controversial. To go to the JCPOA, it is.
So, Klaus, this is a dilemma for the United States, isn't it? It says, if you want us back in the JCPOA, you've got to stop your program. Iran says, we won't stop our program unless you lift sanctions. What's Joe Biden going to do?
This is a dilemma. You're quite right. Essentially, Iran is out of compliance since the middle of 2019. At first, gradually, and now it seems to be increasingly out of compliance. But as everyone says, and I think all the analysts, all the politicians are agreed that they could get back into compliance pretty quickly if they wanted to. And I think so the game is actually not that difficult. Once they arrive at some negotiations, some deal, they could get back into compliance, and then the Biden administration could, of course, lift sanctions, or at least some sanctions. I understand that despite the refusal of Iran to go back to the table as the Americans, a guest of the EU, as was suggested recently, privately there are quite a few contacts going on between the United States and Iranian negotiators, and both sides are not as pessimistic as what we could read in the media, that, you know, there's a breakdown and there's hardly any negotiations or any talks going on. So both sides are moderately optimistic that a deal, how to get together around the negotiating table, is actually quite possible. So no one wants to make the first step, neither Iran for domestic reasons, largely in view of the upcoming elections in June, and also for Biden for domestic reasons, because the Republicans are looking at Biden and will accuse him of being soft on Iran. Therefore, they need some subtle subterfuge to actually get back to the table without losing face to their domestic audience. And I think here the EU comes in. You know, the EU as a mediator, I think, is exaggerated. The EU doesn't have that much influence and power. However, they can, of course, provide deal and circumstances to make both Iran and the United States feel that they are not taking the first step. That actually
Klaus,
was also the deal which came about in 2015, before the deal was actually negotiated, because neither Iran nor the US admitted to taking the first step. So if that was possible in 2015, why not bring it about now in 2021? And I think with some diplomatic imagination, that should really be possible.
Klaus, I want to put your point to Hossein. Do you know anything about talks that are taking place in the background that might lead us to possibly resuming some kind of dialogue over the JCPOA?
Listening to what Klaus said, I have heard a lot the same in the US European media, and we really need to have a correction about the realities of the current situation. Number one is that Iran is a member of JCPOA and the US is not. Therefore, for the first step, the US president should issue an executive order to revoke Trump's order in order to be member of JCPOA. Number one. Second, Iran is already in partial compliance and the US is in zero compliance. You cannot compare. We are not in the equal situation.
No, I do think, Hossein, we understand this, and it's right of you to put it out there. But my question to you is, do you believe that there are talks going on in the background that could lead to some kind of proper dialogue between the United States, which, as you say, has withdrawn from the agreement, and Iran, which is accused of continuing to enrich uranium in breach of the agreement? Do you think these talks are taking place?
No, there is no direct negotiations between Iran and the US. There are some interlocutors like Europeans, like Qatar, like Oman. There are some countries exchanging messages between Tehran and Washington, but there is no direct negotiation between Iran and the US. And I really believe the best and the quickest way is, first of all, for Biden to join JCPOA and then to begin to negotiate in a framework of P5+1 for compliance versus compliance. You know, as long as the US is not member of JCPOA, putting in condition and preconditions for Iran to do what? It is unrealistic.
But can you not see the catch-22 problem here, that the Americans are saying we can't rejoin the JCPOA if Iran continues to be in breach of it by enriching a large amount of uranium to 20%, which is in breach of the agreement?
It is really funny and a joke. The US violated JCPOA, not Iran. Iran for 3 years was in full compliance, the only member of JCPOA with zero failure.
For 3 years.
For 3 years.
But it has stopped being compliant with the JCPOA.
Since 2018, Iran has gradually distanced based on Article 36 of the JCPOA, its commitment, but it is not in full violation. Iran is already in partial compliance, where the US is in zero compliance.
Okay, so that sounds like a stalemate to me. We're going to hear now from Ned Price. He's from the US State Department, talking about, well, what obligations he thinks Iran has.
If Iran comes back into full compliance with its obligations under the JCPOA, the United States would do the same. And then we would then use that as a platform to build a longer and a stronger agreement that also addresses other areas of concern.
Where Ned Price talks about other areas of concern, do you understand what he's referring to?
Of course. I mean, this is what Europeans, they have been talking about, Americans during President Obama, during President Trump, and during President Biden. They want to negotiate about the regional issues. But they all forget that during between 2005 to 2013, Iran proposed the US and Europe and the P5+1, why we should negotiate only on nuclear, why we should not have a broader negotiations. It was the US, it was Europeans insisted only nuclear. And then we agreed on a deal, only nuclear deal. This is only a nuclear deal. This is not about regional issues. And if there is a full compliance, if Europeans, Americans, they comply with their commitments, then the door could be open to negotiate the other issues. But
okay, can I bring Amanda back in here? Because I want to talk about the implications of the European Union getting its act going so that it can bring the two sides together ahead of elections in June, because there is some suggestion that those elections in the summer in Iran could see a more hardline administration in office, and that would make it much more difficult for the two sides to come together.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the ideal scenario would be to have the agreement hammered out before the elections. I mean, that may not be possible. I think as well, we need to sort of differentiate between the situation now with the Biden administration and with the Obama administration, because the difference was with Obama, let's say he wasn't so concerned about what opposition figures in the administration and in the opposition thought. I mean, he was dead set on getting a deal. So he had the political will to do that. I think there's a bit of a difference with the Biden administration. They have other priorities, and I think there's a lot of some concerns about some of the figures that are opposed to going back to the JCPOA in the Democrats, but obviously from the Republicans, and this doesn't help.
So,
I mean, from the side of the EU, they do need to get their act together. But I think we also need to understand that Borrell needs to have everybody speaking in the same voice. And we can see from the developments this week in Vienna that the E3 are not particularly playing the role that would be that helpful for Borrell. I'm sure that he's not pleased with the efforts to sort of censor Iran this week.
The European Union also has to prove that it has leverage with the United States to get the sanctions lifted, Amanda. Does it have that leverage?
I mean, the EU has to push as hard as it can. I mean, this is a very difficult situation because, as already has been mentioned, the US really want the Iranians to take the first step. But I mean, the problem is that, Iran doesn't trust the United States. And you say that they have good reason for that, because at the end of the day, it was the Trump administration that pulled out of the deal. It was a deal that was made in good honor by all parties. So from Tehran's point of view, the United States do need to make the first move. The Americans don't want to do that. And I think it's going to be very hard for the EU to convince the Biden administration actually to make a significant move. But I mean, at least they can put 100% efforts into doing that together with other parties.
Okay, Klaus, Amanda talks there about the fact that there's no trust in the United States. One of the difficulties for Joe Biden in all of this is perhaps the fact that he mustn't be seen in perhaps lifting sanctions and rejoining the JCPOA to be being soft on Iran.
Absolutely. I mean, Biden has a difficult foreign policy course to steer because the Republican opposition, which is, as you know, very large and very formidable, has accused him of being soft in all sorts of ways. Soft on China, possibly soft on Russia, certainly soft on Iran. At the same time, Biden has the intention to be more cooperative, more multilateral. So he wants to bring the Europeans along to all sorts of endeavors, like, for example, a joint foreign policy towards China. And the same he wants to do regarding Iran. That means he needs to be a little bit influenced by the Europeans. He needs to give in to some extent. He cannot just dictate what the transatlantic relationship looks like and where it should totally go. But on the other hand, he's also bound by his own principles, of course, and above all by his own domestic opposition, which he probably is more important than keeping the Europeans online, because in the end his government will fail in the American Congress. It will not fail in Brussels. Therefore, that is really what is his overriding concern. And I think when we talk about partial compliance or full compliance, the other speaker, the Iranian diplomat, certainly had a point, but it ignores the domestic situation in the United States. It also ignores that the Iranians need the sanctions to be lifted. They are in economic trouble and in deep economic trouble. It's not the United States so much. So in a way, the Iranians, whatever the compliance issues really is, and there is some justification to what was said, but the Iranians, need the sanctions to be lifted. So they are essentially much more dependent on making progress regarding getting the Americans back into the nuclear deal. And Biden has to look at his domestic opposition, and therefore he cannot just jump into the nuclear deal. He cannot just issue an executive order and say, now we are part of the nuclear deal again.
Okay, Klaus, I'm going to go to Hossein. I'm going to go to Hossein to ask him to respond to your point, which essentially is that Iran, he believes, is simply playing hardball for the sake of it, when in fact Iran does need the sanctions to be lifted pretty quickly. Therefore, it will give up some ground.
First of all, Iranians, they believe they already have paid the cost. The cost of sanctions and pressures by President Trump and a previous administration because of the nuclear on Iran has been more than the cost any other country like North Korea massive nuclear bomb. Therefore, Iranians, they believe they have already paid the cost. Number one. Number two, of course, Iran needs the sanctions to be lifted, no doubt about it. The economic situation is bad, no doubt about it. But knowing the nature of Iranian nation as a very proud nation with 1,000 years of history, they are not really going to budge down to the US bullying policy. And President Biden, I fully understand his domestic situation. First of all, many, they have exaggerated about the capability of Biden. I knew from the beginning he is practically, when it comes to the region, he is practically a traditionalist. He is surrounded by Israeli lobby in Washington. Bob Menendez is the head of Foreign Relations Committee of Senate. He is a Democrat, but his position on Iran is like John Bolton. Therefore, that's why I do not count too much on Biden. That's why many believe Biden is trying to have a policy between Trump and Obama. But if the current situation continues, after 3, 4, 5 months, then Iran would pass breakout. Iran can tolerate these 2, 3, 4, 5 months. But the US would need to rethink what would be the condition for negotiating with Iran after breakout. And then we should think,
are you saying, sorry, are you saying, Hossein, that unless something's done within 3 or 4 months, the deals are off the table?
I have heard from American officials, from the Biden administration, they say Iran has just 3 months or 4 months to break out. I'm not expertise on the technical issues, but let's say they are through. If they are through, then they would need to negotiate with Iran after breakout. And
breakout, just for the sake of our audience out there, breakout basically means the next almost inexorable step towards bomb making. Hossein, I could talk to you about this for a very long time, but we're running out of said time. So, Amanda, I'm going to come to you on this one, since the main point of the program is to find out what the European Union can do. Apart from informal talks, what cards does it have to play to persuade the Biden administration that it needs to go back into the JCPOA?
Well, I don't think it's just about persuading Biden administration. I think it's about, persuading both sides to show a bit more flexibility, to move away from these sort of maximalist positions, so that they can, step by step, find a way to move this thing forward, because we're running out of time, and we have to look at what's at risk here. I mean, if the JCPOA totally collapses, and I think there's a significant chance that this could actually happen, this is going to have significant repercussions, for the region.
Klaus, I'll ask you to keep it short. I don't think you can hear me that clearly, but if you could keep this answer short, do you think the JCPOA can be saved?
Yes, I do think so, because it's in the interest of all sides. It's in the interest of Iran because of sanctions relief. It's in the interest of the United States for strategic reasons, for anti-nuclear reasons. But it has to be a much more comprehensive agreement to integrate Saudi Arabia and Israel into the deal. So essentially, everyone needs to be happy at the end. And that is, of course, a very formidable task. And here the Europeans, I think, have that mediator role. They are supposed to bring about these diplomatic niceties, these diplomatic framework to bring all that about. And that is a formidable challenge. And here it is really Europe's hour as far as the Iranian nuclear deal is concerned. And one, should really ask them to do the job properly.
Listen, thank you very much for your participation in the program. Thank you. Wherever you happen to be watching this, you can catch up with all editions of Roundtable, this one included, if you go to our YouTube site. That's TRT World Roundtable on YouTube. I'm David Foster, from me and the team. Thanks for watching. We hope to have your company next.